What's up, everybody? This is Danny. This is the first video I'm making on my channel that's like created by me. I'm not trying to make myself out to be like some director, so I used the term creator, loosely. But I read the article of Rory and Mal and how they're, doing their new deal with Sirius XM. Their podcast is going to be distributed through them. And I found it fascinating. I really think that we learned a lot more about the Rory, Mal, Joe Budden dynamic, especially over the last few months of the show and how things were kind of going astray. Overall, I think we learned a lot more about the show than we did over those last pods that they did together. There was a lot of emotion in that room, but in the article, we saw the actual issues Rory and Mal had. And, I'm looking forward to Joe Budden's next show because there was some stuff they said that I'm going to get into later in this video that I don't think he could not address. I mean, you let that go unchecked, and not saying that Rory and Mal are wrong, but I'm just saying that Joe Budden is going to have to address it in his next episode. All right, so stay tuned for the 5 things that I noticed, the biggest revelations from that. As the video goes on, subscribe to the channel, man. This is my first video, and I also want to do something else. I want to thank the Joe Budden podcast subreddit. It's hilarious. It's the funniest sub I've ever seen, and a lot of the dialogue about the show that they have on there is really revealing. I mean, they predict everything about the Joe Budden podcast falling apart. And I think it's fascinating, and it's also really funny. So shout out to them. They very much helped me think about this video and motivated me to kind of talk about it. So subscribe to their sub because it's pretty funny, and the community from the Joe Budden podcast is really hilarious. All right, that's enough. Let's get into the revelations from the Vulture article that featured Rory and Mal. First up is this quote from Mal. This interview was really highlighting some stuff that I found super interesting, and it was him saying that it would have been bad news if they met since the last time they did a show together. So, this is just interesting to me because Mal's a really laid back dude, and for him to say this means that, they might have come to blows, or maybe a verbal altercation where somebody would have had to leave whatever spot they was in. I don't know. It did seem like Mal was kind of fed up with everything Joe had been doing, for kind of undermining their value, replacing him so quickly with Ish and Ice. I could totally see why he wanted to fight, but I didn't think he would verbalize it. I mean, the man called him a sucker on Elliot Wilson's Instagram post. So, yeah, that was the first time. But one of the things I saw in this article that made me think, Mal is not with the funnies, as his man Trevor Ariza would say. Next up is this interesting quote for Rory and Mal. They basically, specifically in this quote, Rory seemed to hint at there being kind of a selfish culture at the Joe Budden podcast, which is funny because the name of the show is the Joe Budden podcast. But I kind of see Rory's point to a certain extent. Joe Budden built his brand off, especially for the podcast, being this, facing culture where he emphasized creative control and stuff like that. But Rory was saying that there was too much egos, so the focus wasn't really about the team. And I know for me, I think like the Joe Budden podcast is how he gets it done. But if you listen to the Joe Budden podcast, the team component is very much stressed. These are my guys, the chemistry, the friendship, that was part of it. So for Rory to hint at there being a culture or cult of personality kind of gets at the fabric of the show and even what he's trying to build now with Ish and Ice. This is another one where Joe Budden's character or moral compass is being called into question. And the last quote was about Joe's selfishness, and it was from Rory, but this is from Mal. So now you got both of them basically hinting at Joe Budden just being a douchebag. There's no other way around it. Being someone who's betraying people. When you look at folks like Marissa Mendez, who used to be a co-host from the I'll Name Your Podcast Later days, the multiple relationships he had, even people like Arab, who I think he didn't end on good terms with when he did his album Rage Against the Machine, and even in their response where, you know, Mal said that he never thought Joe Budden would do him like that, but he did do him like that. This is all from Mal's perspective, and to be honest, I kind of see it. You know, I'm kind of I'm team Rory and Mal, but ultimately I acknowledge that Joe Budden is a big reason that the success of the show, why it took off, with Rory and Mal definitely being parts of the show that, you know, helped make Joe an easier pill to swallow. Because prior to their arrival of Mal, or prior to the arrival of Mal, I kind of found just listening to Joe's takes being a labor, like being something that it was very hard. And Mal, even though he's too cool for school, he kind of takes Joe's off the wall personality and frames it in such a way where it's more easier to get, because when Joe goes off or jumps off, Mal is always there to corral him or say something like that's crazy, or reframe it in a way that's easier to say. But anyway, interesting quote, and something that you know, two of these revelations now focus on Joe Budden's lack of character and also his selfishness. Next one is, this one is particularly a big one for me, because one of the biggest critiques of Rory and Mal was that they brought no value to the show. And Joe kind of played into that when they fell apart and hinted at them not really adding anything to the show. In the last episode, well, the episode where he fired them, he would talk about how, you know, they wouldn't really comment on any new subjects, hinting at how everybody was their mans and they didn't want to give any advice. They only showed up to the show for what they wanted to do, which stood in sharp contrast to Joe Budden, who said that he made the show his life, and everything about the show. You know, he would focus on the show. He would listen to the show in his spare time. He would even watch bloggers. This is all from episode 437, where Joe kind of sets fire to the rain and kicks Rory and Mal off the show for good, or at least providing closure. Well, anyway, in this quote, Mal says that, you know, they didn't really have much creative control, and anything that they tried to suggest really wouldn't be welcomed with open arms and would be shut down immediately by the team. And I'm thinking that's coming from Joe Budden, but I'm also wondering if this is kind of an Ian thing. Ian is Joe Budden's manager. I don't know. This is all alleged. And yeah, so that's interesting. And it also probably hints at why Mal and Rory really wasn't contributing to the show. I would say it really got glaring from the lower three, like the higher 300 episodes, all the way up to the final episode where they were on together. And the top revelation that I found interesting was this one. It's pretty short and sweet. It's Rory saying that he ran into Joe, but it wasn't really a conversation. And this immediately made me think about the picture where, you know, Rory looks like he's about to kill Joe Budden while he's holding some type of bottle of alcohol, and he's looking at Joe Budden, who seems to be having the time of his life. A lot of people try to interpret that picture and try to say like this means that they're cool, they're in the same spot at the same time. But I kind of thought that it didn't indicate that at all. A picture is worth 1,000 words. That's the saying, but it's probably not true. It's just the saying. It's hard to decipher where these two gentlemen were at in terms of their thought process and seeing each other. But this quote from Rory probably reveals a little bit about that picture. You know, he's saying he ran into him, but it really wasn't a conversation. To me, means that they're not on good terms. They probably still have ill feelings, or at least Rory has ill feelings to Joe. And so I found that very, very fascinating. And one thing that kind of frames this for me is Joe Budden's commentary. The clip from his episode, one of his episodes, where he's celebrating being an independent for a year, and he's talking about the picture that he ran into Rory, where he ran into Rory. And one thing that's fascinating and that he always does is he kind of hides behind the guise of, oh, this really isn't for y'all. Y'all really don't know what's going on, when he's talking about the fan base. But oftentimes the fan base actually does know what's going on. But in this case, it seems like Rory and Joe ain't really on the same page, and there's a lot of friction. So yeah, that's basically the observations that I've seen from this Vulture article. I'm going to link it in the description of the video. I think this is fascinating and definitely represents an escalation in the war between Rory and Mal and Joe Budden. I know people think that, these two people, these factions of what used to be the old school Joe Budden podcast, that they're kind of moving on, but I think it's heating up. Mostly because now Rory and Mal have really proved their point and were able to get value from the show that they created without Joe. And Joe also himself has to be reeling at the fact that some of the value that they created, he will not be profiting off of. And he has shows on his networks, which quite frankly are garbage. I don't want to say that about See. The thing is, I think they have an interesting show, and I think they're building something that maybe in a year or two will be surprised. I think they one guest away, maybe like a Kevin Samuels or someone else. They're really close to turning the corner. I find the two hosts interesting and hateable, and that's really all you need in the podcast space. But the other one with Karen Civil is trash. That is a terrible podcast, and honestly, I think Joe should just cut that off. I think they're coming back, and I don't know why. I think they should have just phased it out. I know Karen Civil has seen a lot of controversy, but I really don't care about that. It's more about the podcast, and I think it's terrible. But nonetheless, this is very interesting article from Vulture, and if you're a fan of the Joe Budden podcast, especially the Rory and Mal days, which was a lot of episodes, you should check it out. I'm gonna be thinking about doing more content about the Joe Budden show, and it's not necessarily just to do it. I really enjoy the community that comes with the Joe Budden show. A lot of the fans are hilarious, and not even just Joe Budden, because now Rory and Mal are their own entity. But yeah, it's a fun group to be a part of. I really think the JBP sub is awesome. It's really fun on Reddit. So if you want to learn more about the Joe Budden podcast, please subscribe to that Reddit. I'm part of it. I be on there reading all the funny ass comments. Yeah, so yeah, that's my rundown of some of the things that I noticed from the Vulture article. And I'm curious to see how their first episode on November 2nd looks. I'm wondering about how their studio is, because a lot of people like the setup of their current podcast, but I don't. I think it's kind of awkward. Rory and Mal are really close to each other, and when they look at each other, they're like really in eye to eye, and the chairs are like swinging back and forth. That is weird to me, and I want a more studio setup, something where it's clearly that they're doing a media show. Whereas it's a little too intimate for me with the darkness of the room, and I also want a setup that's better for guests. But I'm hoping that the audio steps up now that they're gonna have access to the Sirius studios. But yeah, that's it for me. This is The Stop. I'm Danny. Please subscribe if you like this. If you don't, you can also thumb me down or disagree with me in the comments. I'm always down to go back and forth with people, and not in a disrespectful way. But yeah, just subscribe, and see you soon.